Can I just use my position on stage to get these two up, and can we just give them a round of applause, because they really did. Where do you want?
This in the middle, not in the middle, centre stage.
So many faces staring.
Okay, just before we start, just like to introduce Hugh Lanning. We're very lucky to have him with us. He's the chair of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. Yep. So I'm going to ask him for his reflections in a moment. But first of all, I just want to say, Josh...
Actually, can I just interrupt? Because if you don't know, this is Robb Leech. And Rob is trying to get 1,000 Twitter followers today. So if we could just all follow him on Twitter. He's about 20 short. He'd really appreciate that. Couldn't resist.
19, actually.
Rob with 2 B's.
Rob with 2 B's as well. Rob, R-O-B-B-L-W.
Robb Leech.
Josh, fantastic film, absolutely beautifully shot, and I think you describe it as the personal tale of a political story, and I think the film achieves that and more. And I know you're really nervous. It's your world premiere of the process, but I mean, personally, I was blown away by it. So I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Am I going to have to pay you for that? Are you going to invoice me for that comment?
No, you can have that for free. Many of you may or may not know that this is actually Josh's first film, which I think makes it even more sort of incredible. So I want to give him another round of applause for that, because making his first film can be incredibly difficult. And on the subject of making first films, I think most people you find tend to make films about either themselves or their alcoholic grandmother, or it's something that's kind of on their doorstep that's really easy. And you decided to go to Gaza to make a film about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is probably one of the most complex and sort of unforgiving topics of our time. Why? Why did you decide? That's not easy,
I think that's probably why this film isn't. So I have a background in news journalism, and that's why this film isn't hopefully shot like a news journalist piece. I don't really know why, to be honest with you. I was kind of really captivated by the topic and a little bit fed up about how, I shouldn't really say this, but how we portray it in mainstream media. We often get it wrong, both factually and we have a bias, and I just thought it'd be quite interesting to do a film that tried to tell a bit more of an honest perspective, hopefully from both sides. I know Israel gets a bit of a kicking, but hopefully it does give the perspective how it's seen from the other side a little bit. At the end of the day, the situation is how it is, and you can't really hide that. But in terms of my inspiration for it, I kind of love Middle East geopolitics and just fell in love with the subject. It was a bit of a wanky answer, I'm sorry.
That'll do just fine. And so is it sort of born out of the sort of frustration then, of your frustration about the way in which it's kind of misunderstood, or? Yeah,
I guess to a certain extent. I mean, look, we could have made this a much more violent film, and we could have put a lot more of the violence in there and a lot more of the insanity, but to me, it's just all the shades of grey. How this process continues, this big political press conference thing, we're making progress to solving the conflict. And actually, to the people on the ground, things are just getting worse. I mean, Gaza, when I went, was the worst it had been since the invasion. Today, it's even worse than that. I mean, Gaza's a place where you don't have running water, running blackouts. Actually, when I first got there, a journalist friend of mine had said, look, the tap water is salty, so don't drink it, brush your teeth with that. But I got to my hotel, and I'd heard some hotels basically have water tanks so you can get fresh water. So I was thinking, great, I'll just have a shower turned the tap on, it was hot, and I was like, great, this is fresh water. And I sort of jumped in the shower and opened my eyes under the shower head, and it was burning hot salt water, which went straight into my eyes, at which point I leapt out doing a sort of naked dance, and threw the water that I'd been brushing my teeth in into my eyes, which was full of toothpaste. So that was sort of my introduction to Gaza.
And with my filmmaker's hat on, I think a lot of the time people go out to make a film, and they have some kind of rough idea of, well, hopefully, an idea about the story which they want to tell. But I think often when they come back from shooting, they realise that it's nothing like how they expected, and the story changes. I just wondered whether or not you kind of had experience of that making the process.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, for those of you who supported us on Kickstarter, you know that we kickstarted a very different film. So this actually started out as a film called Friday. And I actually, a week before I was due to fly out, so we fully financed, all the gear's together, all the training's done, we found out that somebody had made a very similar film to what I was intending to make. So I arrived in Tel Aviv at 3 in the morning, having to rethink the film I was going to do and literally write it as I went, which is where the process came from, which is an explanation to some of the Kickstarter backers. And for me, actually, I wouldn't have said this at the time, there would have been a lot more swearing involved, but that was a blessing because it made a much more balanced film that really sort of showed the perspective of the conflict, or at least I hope it did. I mean, you told me you watched it. Did that answer the question? Am I just on tangent central right now?
So, yeah, I mean, you had 3 really strong characters in the film. And you say, so you went out there and you had an idea about what you were trying to do.
Yeah, I met Lola, actually, on the first night in the hotel I was staying in. I sort of started talking to her until about 4 AM, and I was like, oh, I'm trying to get access to some settlements. I know it's really hard, because it is. I mean, there's so many shots in this film where it might just be, you know, sort of 3 seconds long, but, I mean, the amount of times I was almost arrested just for filming things. And the great thing was I'd been sort of signed off as Israeli press, and traditionally Israel do not give press passes to cameramen. They'll give them to print journalists, and obviously with my work with the Times and Amy Basil, who's at the back there, doing some very great sweet talking of the Israeli press office, they gave me this press card, which then meant I could pretty much go wherever I wanted. I could walk into army bases, providing I have this card. Which is how I filmed the detention scene, because there were multiple times.
You winged the entire film.
Exactly. It was a giant wing. That would be the takeaway from it. It looks pretty, though.
It does look very pretty. Actually, I'll just ask, I'm going to pass over to Hugh. So, as I said, Hugh is the chair of the Palestinian Solidarity campaign. Yep. After watching the film, what are your kind of reflections? What did you take away from it? And is there any kind of perspective which maybe you'd like to add?
I mean, first I'd just like to say well done. I mean, one, it was good. I mean, it was really did tell the story. And one of the things that we say in the campaign, I mean, although we have a perspective, obviously, as the Palestine Solidarity campaign, but actually when people go, we say, just look at the reality and come back and say what you see. And that's enough. And I think that's what Joshua's done in this film. He went and looked and has reported the people's stories, what he saw and what he came across. And we think that's enough, because actually when you do see the reality, when you see the war, when you see Gaza, when you see the things, you know that there is an injustice going on that has to be put right. And you don't need to have the polemic and all of the other stuff on top of that personal story. So I think that the approach is a very powerful one that works really well. But I also know that it can't have been easy. Getting into Gaza, the restrictions of getting around, although you know you did Kalandia and so on, places like that, for people to get around. Normally it's easier for white Westerns to get around, but it's generally very, very difficult. So there must be quite a lot of technical problems in actually doing it. But also I just, I mean, I know quite a few of the people in there, and I think telling the effect of the process on people, and you know, it's been going on for decades. centuries. All right, the most recent process, Oslo, is 20 years. The occupation is since 1967. The lack of there being Palestine is from the Second World War, when the UN first promised there's going to be one, and so on, and you can track it back. So the process is almost like an endless one for the Palestinians, I suppose I knew there wasn't going to be a happy ending. It was a documentary that you knew that it was going to be truthful, and at the end there would still be an unresolved problem, which is there is now.
I think that's kind of one of the things I took away from it, is that the futility of it, and not really. And you get to the end of the film, and there isn't really. There's no sort of end in sight. There's no resolution, as you say. So perhaps actually, a question both of you could answer, or try to answer, is, what of the future? I mean, you've made this film, and you've laid it out, and it's a wonderful insight. But as far as kind of your experience goes, I mean, what happens? I mean, how does this resolve?
It's not going to resolve anytime soon. I believe the film states that quite clearly. We're at a point now where Netanyahu has paused negotiations. So basically in the West Bank you have one form of leadership, which is Fatah, and then in Gaza you have Hamas. So for a long time there's been sort of a falling out there between Palestinian leadership, which is inherently corrupt itself. They have just done a sort of reunification deal, which has offended Israel. Hamas is considered a terrorist organisation internationally, but it looks like America was talking to Hamas in Gaza for about 6 months before the talks break down, trying to sort of orchestrate that. So at the moment you have this attempt on the Palestinian side to reunify and bring the two sides together, and that's largely because the situation, as I said, in Gaza got so bad. When the regime changed in Egypt, that border got shut down. Israel has tightened its access to Gaza. It was very difficult for me to get in, and now you have the world's biggest prison. So in terms of the Palestinian side, there's this attempt to reunify. I think that will continue in a form of lots of infighting. And then from the political perspective, I think there is no hurry to solve this conflict. From Israel's perspective, I'll just say, and then I'll stop talking, sorry Rob, is that it doesn't benefit them to resolve this conflict. I mean, look, if you go for a one-state solution, they no longer have a Jewish state. If you have a two-state solution, then they don't have the land that they want, and they lose control of borders, say, with Jordan. So why would you fix it? You'd keep it going as long as possible. It just makes sense.
That's very much the kind of political story, I guess, and what the film does so brilliantly is, we get this insight into the personal tale, the people actually on the ground. And as far as kind of those people are concerned, I mean, there's that wonderful scene when Lola visits the Palestinian family. I can't remember what her name is. Tamimi and Nala. And it's really awkward to start with. Like really, really awkward. And of course, they don't know that she's a settler. And I think she was in the IDF as well. But then as it goes along, they kind of warm to each other, and they sort of start to respect each other a little bit. And for me, I'm watching that and I'm thinking, well, that's the kind of way forward. Surely it's actually the people on the ground actually kind of understanding each other. But of course, that's so hard when they're on either side of this is it sort of buffer zone, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there's complete separation between the two sides. Hannah Khalil, wherever you are, I think somewhere, really felt that this film portrayed women in quite a good light, which I was happy about. But as you say, I think the only real route forward is dialogue, and from the international community, international law doesn't really mean much there. And until there's a base level recognition of international law, we can have all the negotiations we want, but they're not founded upon anything. So, I mean, it's just not going anywhere anytime soon.
Just, Hugh, maybe you can add a few words.
Just a couple of things, because I think one of the things is about the impact on people. And I don't know if you remember the guy, the Israeli with the beard who spoke. He was from an organisation called Breaking the Silence, and they are Israeli soldiers who have served in the IDF, who've come to the conclusion actually that the position is not morally sustainable, and that they've spoken out. They've come under a lot of grief for doing that. And on the other side, the Tamimi family, actually if you go to the village, it's like the Tamimi village. Everyone in that village is affected. And when I was in Gaza, you talk to somebody and everyone has had somebody killed. And those pictures of the children who were being chased. 1 in 5 Palestinians has been in prison, and a lot of them are child prisoners or started as child prisoners. That impact on the psychology, I don't think the status quo is sustainable or just. And I agree with what Joshua has just said. The statement at the end that there is a one-state reality, i.e. that Israel effectively controls things from the River Jordan through to the Mediterranean. It needs to be judged and held accountable by international law on its behaviour in those areas. And if that was the starting point of how things were done, then I think that would give some hope and prospects for the future. And they need to be judged. And I think the process, be it called the peace process or whatever, has been used as camouflage, if you like, a lot of the time, for that judgment not to be taken place. And I think now is the time when collectively we ought to be saying we've got international standards, they should be applied there to both sides, to everybody. International law will be a good starting point for that to happen.
Lola, she'd really like to hear about your life here, and then the conversation went from there. Did that answer the question? Go again.
I really enjoyed it, and I did find it really insightful and a fresh perspective on the conflict. But I'd like to ask you a more sort of technical filmmaking question, which is when and why did you decide to be a part of the film yourself? Because obviously you're not from there, and you're telling people stories who are, and they are, really fascinating stories. But I just wondered, what that kind of conversation was with yourself about being a part of the film.
You mean, what's a 24-year-old white boy doing in the West Bank making films?
Similar question.
How do I?
It's a good question.
It is. It's a great question.
Because you have that. You make no attempt to hide your relationship with the characters in the film. We hear your voice on screen, and obviously your voice narrates it.
The narration's actually an interesting one. So initially I don't know if any of you have seen a film called Iraq in Fragments, but it's like the most purest, amazing documentary ever. Very long, very endurance, but initially I tried to just do this without any voiceover. So the first cut we delivered had no voiceover in it. And that was very much a reflection of what you're saying, of not wanting to make myself part of the story. But somebody turned around and said, you need to put voiceover in this. So otherwise it makes no sense. It's beautiful, but nobody understands.
Can I just ask a quick question? Why did you want it? Why did you not want your voice to be part of the film?
I didn't want to be the story. As I said, white boy running around the West Bank with a camera. And the thing is, it was about trying to find the balance between, obviously I'm making a film, obviously I'm selecting shots, I'm taking Lola there, so there is an element of production in this. I'm producing this, but hopefully I managed to strike the balance between just saying, look, this is what's going on. And I certainly I did manage to do that before the voiceover, and hopefully the voiceover just serves to guide you with the knowledge I have in my head of what's the sort of going on either side of the situation and help you through the story. But hopefully I don't come across too much as the story is me. My face isn't in it, at least. Probably because I was filming it by myself, otherwise my ego would have been right in front of camera.
Any other questions? At the back. We got a mic. Yeah.
Is it Misha or Grace? I don't know.
There's two there, I think.
Oh, okay. I was saying Lola seems like quite a conflicted character in her opinions of everything that's going on, and she's not necessarily the most informed, or chooses not to be. But her dad, she mentioned her dad a lot. And I just wondered how much you think his opinions on everything made that kind of conflict.
Lola is in a point, and was then more than ever. Her dad had died 3 months before I met her, so she's in a massive place of grief. And I think, as such, her dad's perspective and reality and all of his thoughts, she'd very much absorbed as a sort of a point of loneliness. loneliness. But Lola, as a person, and as you say, naive, and this isn't meant to be insulting, but that's the majority of sort of the young, liberal Tel Avivian population because of the level of separation, and that's kind of why I keep referencing separation, because these people don't talk to each other anymore, they don't even have to see each other. So nobody on either side really has too much idea about what the other side is thinking and doing. So her perspective actually, sadly, isn't really that unique at all.
One more behind,
yeah. I was just curious, why did you decide to start telling the story in '93 and not '67 or '48, or why there specifically?
Purely because I only had an hour, and as this was the first cut of, I mean, this is a super stripped down cut of taking so much information out of it, because there's so much detail that can go into this. So for me, the peace process, sort of passing the 20-year mark of existence, was the sort of point I thought, okay, right, we'll go for that. That will be our jumping off point for this political story, because as you say, you can go back to, I mean, you can go back to the late 1800s, but then this film would have been a history film, and that wasn't what it was about. As much as it isn't really about politics, it's more about the effects of conflict on people's lives and how they end up perceiving each other. So that's why I picked the sort of the 93, let's start with Oslo, because you really see the effect of Oslo today. You know, Oslo was an agreement to create a Palestinian state, to basically solve this conflict, and all it's really done is polarize it further. I mean, I won't bore you for too long, but one of the things that came out of Oslo was this zoning system in the West Bank. So the West Bank is divided into 3 zones, A, B and C. A is Palestinian controlled, B is sort of dual control, and C is Israeli military control. And there was going to be a gradual handing back of control to the Palestinians, and these zones would fade away. But that was paused in 2000, and now today 61% or 62% actually of the West Bank is controlled by the Israeli military. So you have this tiny piece of land, and you see that map at the wall, but actually within that tiny piece of land, 62% of that is controlled absolutely by Israel.
Any more questions? Yeah, oh, lots more questions now.
Do you intend to show this to both sides?
Yeah, we've actually had a lot of interest from Israeli festivals in the US, Jewish festivals. They've actually reached out to us. So absolutely. And I think it's going to be screened in Ramallah. I sent it to a friend of mine who was like, yeah, we'd love to screen it. And I'd love to screen it in Israel as well. Very much so.
Okay, at the back of the room.
You said about Lola being quite naive. I just wonder whether you found any young Israelis that were politically aware with a really balanced view, not just a totally biased to Israeli view.
Yeah, I mean, No, who's the guy with dark hair, glasses. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's wearing his t-shirt inside out. He's one of the journalists who gives perspective. Noam's a really interesting guy because he's actually quite young. He's also a former Israeli commander. So he was a commander in the IDF, and he was imprisoned for refusing to serve in the West Bank anymore. He now is a left-wing journalist in Israel, and he's incredibly switched on. And all the international journalists really respect him. He's kind of like the go-to guy. On a societal level, there are definitely people who are aware, but I think there's to make a bit of a generalisation, the ones that do become aware normally become so shocked that they then sort of take it to this extreme activist end where they go and they participate in demonstrations and things like that, which is good to a point. But one of the things Manal and Bilal started saying to me is, you know, when this first started happening and Israelis started coming in here, they were walking in front of us at the demonstrations to protect us. Now it's kind of almost like a war tourism. And I think that's, again, a reflection of this polarisation and this separation. Because, I mean, getting shot at is exciting, right? If you're a young kid, it's like, oh, this is a new experience. Until you get shot.
Could I just do one comment? Yeah, go for it.
Just on Lola, I mean, one of the things I think you realise, and it was pointed out in the film, but if you're within Israel, and Tel Aviv is perhaps the most example, you don't see the occupation, you don't see the West Bank, you don't, so that actually you can live, it feels like a sort of like Watership Down life, if you like, that you're roaming around in this area, and it's it is a bubble, but actually a lot of the conversation is not as if they are in occupation. You have to make an effort. You have to go, even if you're in Jerusalem, you have to go out of the sort of the traditional areas, out of the West Jerusalem, to try and get to East Jerusalem and so on. So that's not an atypical Lola. There's lots of Lolas in Israel.
But also, just the Israeli propaganda machine is huge and powerful as well. I mean, not just in Israel, but across the world. I've noticed. I think that sort of plays a big part in.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just to change subject slightly, we also need to recognise that there is a lot wrong within the Palestinian political system. I mean, if you look at Abu Nasser, who I really like, he's actually my favourite character, he's only seeing the benefits of the occupation. He's a part of this elitist group who very much exist within Ramallah, and that have a very different life that's more akin to what you're talking about, that's sort of kind of away from the occupation.
Is it a sort of product of that divide and rule?
Absolutely.
Tactic?
There was a scene in this film that unfortunately we had to cut out, and Abu Nasser went to try and buy the most expensive horse in Israel. He didn't tell his parents, and he failed, but they're a very wealthy family, and they're Palestinian, and they have a very different perspective to the rest of Palestine. And as Joseph Dana puts it in the beginning of the film, when you enrich the elite from the natives, it's colonialism.
I'm going to take, I think, 2 more questions. Got gentleman on the end there. Oh, that's a gentlewoman.
Smooth.
Just want to say, fantastic film, Josh. Beautifully made. But it seems throughout that you told the story how you wanted to tell it. Was there anything or any characters or any parts of it that you just found particularly frustrating that stopped you telling the story how you wanted to, or held you up in telling the story?
There's so much. Okay, so we shot 77 hours of footage, so there are about 8 other stories to tell, and so some of my favourite stuff is not in this film. So there were plenty of things that frustrated me. I mean, you've got the extreme stuff that we didn't include. That there's a guy who you see very briefly at the end when we're talking about apartheid. There's a man whose house is actually in a cage. So he's refused to leave his house. He's refused to have his house bulldozed. So it's almost comical. It's so absurd. The response from the Israeli military is simply to build his house into a cage, brick a wall in front of his view, and hand him a key so he can get in and out every day. That's an amazing story. On the same side, Gaza, there are about 1 million things I could have made in Gaza that I would have liked to have had in that. In terms of obstructions to telling the story, once I had the Israeli press card, it made things a lot easier. I mean, this film was incredibly hard to make. I did not most of it, I did a third of it with a broken foot. So I was pretty grumpy most of the time, and Kaj and Amy, wherever they are, can vouch for the amount of phone calls where I just swear at them, I think, through lack of painkillers. But in terms of sort of narrative storytelling and obstructions, I mean, the whole thing was just really hard.
Okay.
I just wanted to point it out as well. I want to congratulate you because I have seen many films. Sorry. I have seen many documentaries about the problem between Palestine and Israel. And it's the first time in my life I saw a kind of middle-class Palestinian family situation, and the guy buying horses and free pass to go to Israel, catch a flight. Actually, it's one thing people always say, you can never fly to Palestinian. You have always to fly somewhere else to get to Palestinian. So I want to congratulate. I think it was a very good way in perspective.
Thank you.
What I wanted to point it out as well is you pointed at Lola naivety towards the problem, which is at her home, is in that level. Imagine the whole world. I know people that haven't got a clue what the problem is between Palestine and Israel. So how can we bring up the awareness
of people. Well, doing films like you did is a good thing, but I think going back into the history as not from 1993, it would be a good exercise, because I think people don't understand what's going on.
Maybe another film, Josh.
I think also we have to remember that Abu Nasser is incredibly naive as well. I mean, he's incredibly unaware of the fate of his fellow Palestinians.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think also with this topic, like one of the questions as to why people are like, why the hell did you make a film about that? It's an incredibly uncool topic. I mean, we're not talking about apartheid South Africa now, you know, which you get Live Aid and you get bands playing and things like that. There is a societal issue within this society, and indeed the West, a reluctance to talk about the issue because the narrative in mainstream media is, look, it's too complex. You don't want to approach it, you don't want to offend anyone, all the Holocaust and things like that. And they're all great points, but it doesn't mean you can't talk about it. And hopefully what I was trying to do with this film, again going back to what you said about sort of just what were you doing there, was to just show the situation for how it is. It's got really bad. You have two societies living under one government effectively. One has equal human and civil rights and the other doesn't. That's apartheid. And the fact of it is, you have a former Israeli brigadier general, who also, which isn't in there, you know, he was former head of Israeli intelligence for a while, so he knows his stuff. And he's a former peace negotiator. And if he's prepared to turn around and say, on camera, yeah, we're going to head to an apartheid state, we're also basically there, then you really have to look at the situation. But that becomes a difficult thing for the mainstream public to grasp. And it's a bit frightening because you don't want to offend people. I don't know if that answered the question. Sorry.
Yeah, it did. Two more questions then. This guy in the middle.
Thank you.
And there's one group of population within sort of Israel-Palestine, sorry, that you don't portray. I don't know if you thought about doing it, which is all the Arabs or Israelis. Did you talk to them, or do you have footage about them talking about the problem? Do they know what's happening?
Do you mean Palestinians of 48, or?
Yeah, well, there's a couple hundred, almost a million Arabs who live in Israel, sort of not in the West Bank, and their opinions not in the film at all. And I just wanted to know if you thought about including them. Or
That's actually probably a really good way to answer Dan's question earlier, which is, you know, there were just, I mean, I could have had another 2 characters in this film, but it would have just got so hard to tell a consistent story, and then there's a whole other level of explanation that you have to bring into the situation. And as it is anyway, I would have, in hindsight, I would have liked to have brought characters into the beginning of this film much earlier, to sort of stick with them a bit and develop them a bit, but it was just really important to try and get the context of the situation to the audience first, and then go into the characters. So I think had I had to approach that, which you're right, it would have been really good to have that in there, but it would have just really convoluted things, unfortunately.
Okay, last question. So the gentleman on the corner, just getting you a microphone.
And you did this program, right? And do you think it's going to make any, because they have been making several programs like this, do you think it's going to make any difference?
Well, do I think it's going to make difference, was the question.
Hundreds of programs made by Palestine, it's going on forever.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I don't find out, you say the Hamas, they are terrorists, right? But they talk it like Nelson Mandela, they talk it Martin McGuinness, right?
So can you put the mic just a bit closer to your phone? Mike, I can't hear you.
No, what I'm trying to say, like, they say Hamas is a terrorist organization. They spoke to Nelson Mandela, who's supposed to be a terrorist, right? They spoke to Martin McGuinness, who's supposed to be a terrorist. So why can't they talk to everybody? And then all this, the peace process is like a political game, because nobody has a sincerity to solve the problem, you see? Because it's like it's a game.
I'm glad you're taking that away from the film. That's good that you take that. In terms of the perception and hypocrisy of politicians, I think that happens everywhere throughout history. So yes, Mandela was a terrorist. I mean, you look at David Cameron. David Cameron campaigned, not many people know this, for his execution. So there's political hypocrisy everywhere. I mean, was there a specific question you wanted me to answer?
The other things, right? Like when you talk about terrorism, because in your eye, you might be a terrorist. But in somebody else's eye, he's a freedom fighter, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody is, so basically, they have to get everybody together. It doesn't matter whether there's a terrorist, but they've got to get everybody's view to find the solution, right? But the problem is the people talk about controlled by the strong Jewish lobby. And at the same time, they want to keep the Arabs in peace because they want their oil. So they want to keep this going forever.
Well, that's kind of the takeaway, right? That this is a process that continues.
Essentially, his question is, do you think the film is going to make a difference?
Well, I mean, there's 200 people came to see this screening, and it's our first screening, which is great. So hopefully that's 200 people with a slightly different perspective on things that will talk about it or not talk about it, because it's not really a casual conversation thing, but have a changed perspective.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Josh, for an amazing film, and for you for coming along too. I'm sure Josh will be hanging around if you want to ask him.
Thank you to all of you for coming. It's really kind of you. I'm really, really grateful. Thank you. And thank you to Rob. Please follow him on Twitter.